Hello and welcome to Headlines Special. The true nature of Armenia's EU membership bid, without being shrouded in obscurity as such, is still somewhat enigmatic in view of its perceived implausibility. Yerevan's close economic ties with Russia and carefully calibrated at what one may call deliberately fluid and non-committal language employed by Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. After the country's parliament adopted the bill on EU accession at first reading last week with 63 votes in favour and 7 against, many had been anticipating that this very moment would be publicly endorsed and celebrated during the Armenian leaders' meeting with EU Council President Antonio Costa on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference last Friday on the 14th of February. Nothing of the kind happened, with readouts released subsequent to the meeting merely referring to the exchange being meaningful and the importance of multifaceted EU-Armenia relations. It's worth remembering that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan telephoned the EU Council President on the 13th of January, just a few days after his government formally endorsed a draft bill on what was terminologically labelled as a start of a process of Armenia's accession to the European Union. Russia, Armenia's treaty ally, leading trading partner and key energy supplier, has voiced its concerns, warning of economic consequences, making it very clear that EU membership bid would mark the beginning of its withdrawal from the Moscow-dominated Eurasian Economic Union. European Union's share in Armenia's foreign trade has fallen considerably since Pashinyan's rise to power in 2018, with the trade turnover with Russia having increased massively, which is reported to be largely down to Yerevan's role as a conduit in helping Moscow in circumvention of sanctions levied against it by Western countries. All of these cumulatively have given rise to the fundamental question as to whether Armenia can legitimately be expected of being genuinely interested in joining the European Union at the expense of existing and more lucrative markets. Ultimately, it appears that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's thinking is informed by those considerations. His Deputy Foreign Minister, Payrul Hovhannisyan, recently stated that adoption of the bill does not constitute an application for Armenia's membership in the European Union. And in reality, this is designed as a clear message to the European side about moving the partnership to a qualitatively new stage. And joining me today from Yerevan, Armenia is Dr. Aspet Kochikyan, Professor of Political Science and International Relations. Welcome to Headlines, Aspet.
Thank you, Orkhan, for having me.
It's a great pleasure and honor. Your academic focus has, amongst other things, been on foreign policy choices of small and weak nations, questions of identity and regional developments, with a particular focus on the Middle East and Eurasia. Armenia is a relatively small country. It's not big geographically, territorially. It's not very powerful as yet, and it wants to become a member of the European Union. And more than anything else, it wants to be seen as a nation that wants to become a member of the European Union as well. Is this purely driven by perceived economic advantages of being a member of the European Union, or would you say there is also a connection with that desire of belonging to a greater, mighty civilizational force as well?
Right. Very good question. And the way you pose the question, Orkhan, is really gives a lot of food for thought. You know, in developing countries, there's always the need to be westernized, to be part of the West, because the West is considered to be the standard that everyone tries to get to. Now, this could be mostly in economic development context, but it also can be from a political development context, meaning, you know, rule of law, human rights, and so on and so forth. I'm wary of not using the word democracy these days because I'm not sure what that means in general. But I think in many post-Soviet countries, the West has been the standard that they all aspire to, and making it synonymous or thinking that it's synonymous with stability and development and so on. So this, I think, is the first thing that one needs to realize and keep in context when thinking about European Union ascension by Soviet or former Soviet republics, including Armenia and Georgia. The other thing is that I think there's a narrative that is very much part of the mindset of people, policymakers and individuals on the ground in society, that Armenia being a country, and I'm not endorsing this or in any way, but I'm just saying that Armenia has culturally, culturally part of the European fabric. So in that sense, it has been, one of the key motivators for Armenia's pro-EU sort of sentiments, let's call it.
Yep. That bill, which was publicly endorsed by the government of Nikol Pashinyan, and a bill which has already been adopted, terminologically is very ambiguous. It says that this is a beginning, start of an EU accession process, but the government officials said that this is not an application to become a member of the European Union, so it's merely of symbolic nature, and we haven't heard anything from the European Union institutions. What is the underlying factor for Pashinyan to be so hell-bent on this particular bill? Do you think that in the light of the upcoming elections, he may need the support of certain segment of Armenian society?
Yes and no. I think there is an element here that we have to consider. At least they're wary enough and they're conscious enough, the government, to highlight that this is not in any way a start. I think they're trying to bring down the expectation by the people, because as we know, the moment you announce something, again, an uninformed populace would end up celebrating that, oh, we're being member of the EU. The other thing is that I think it is a signal that Armenia is turning, I wouldn't call it 180 degrees, but it is turning drastically towards Europe. So it's a message, sending a message to Europe and the West, in this context, to Europe, that Armenia is willing to do anything and everything needed to join that union. The problem is the EU, as you mentioned, is not responding to this, or is unresponsive, mostly because of the fact, A, that's not the top agenda on their, or the top item on their agenda. There are a lot of, as you mentioned, in the Munich Security Conference or Forum, there were a lot of clashes with the US and the future of what's going to happen with Ukraine, especially today, if I'm not mistaken, they're meeting in Paris. So A, it's not a priority. B, I suspect that there is a concern about a failed such example or a failed such experiment with Georgia. Starting in 2008, and when there was an attempt, or even earlier, there was an attempt to incorporate Georgia into EU, and the EU was so happy and so sort of committed to Georgia, and now we see Georgia completely turning its back. So I think there's also that caution from EU to accept it. And in terms of, I think, political calculation, it's always a political calculation. Who knows what goes on in the mind of policymakers and the politician? But I think the fact that in most public opinion surveys show an increasing pro-Western sentiments, this could be partially also targeting people to support the government in that process.
Yeah, we know that the bill was originally, I think this draft bill was proposed by some pro-Western parties, which are extra parliamentary forces, late 2024. To what extent do you think that the Armenian government's current position, which is quite unique, and also does entail two fundamental elements, perhaps. One is that Armenia is still, for very perhaps understandable, perhaps less understandable reasons, is still within the Russian realm of influence, being a member of the Russia-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, with the Armenian economy being closely intertwined with Russian economy, is still publicly visibly pro-European. This position in itself looks quite contradictory as well, but it is positively appreciated by some European policy makers. Quite often the arguments voiced by the EU officials is that we have to be understanding towards Armenia's current situation, the position which they normally do not show in relation to Azerbaijan, for instance. How long do you think Prime Minister Pashinyan will be able to plod on in this fashion, remaining within the Russian realm for very practicable purposes, but still remaining publicly and rhetorically pro-European?
Well, this is what makes it, I'm not saying that this is the case, but this is what makes a very skillful politician and a diplomat, right? Armenia's balancing act between the West on the one hand, in this case Europe, and Russia on the other, is not new. I mean, we had that in the 90s, but then again in early to mid 2000, what they actually labeled it as complementary foreign policy, which was used extensively, even though a lot of people who used it didn't understand what that meant. But I think we have to also understand that in this context, Europe, probably in any rational diplomatic sort of context, they do want to have some kind of a back contact with Russia, even if it's insignificant. And Armenia might signify that. The other thing is to also realize that, you know, when it comes to collaboration and cooperation, economic, security, political, these are three different mindsets and three different spheres. And it is possible for a country to have economic integration, not integration, but close economic ties with one country while having while having a political one or cultural one with another. I think you're absolutely right, Orkhan, that it is a fine balancing act. And he can milk this cow as much as he can, Prime Minister Pashinyan, unless Russia starts taking a real action. For instance, increasing the gas prices, the gas and oil prices, which actually is sold to Armenia below market price. But at the same time, Russia needs Armenia's backdoor sort of economy. I'm not saying it's a monumental or huge, but it is still some kind of a significant impact on Russian market, especially on luxury goods and especially on the embargo. So it is quite interesting sort of a phenomenon to see this. I do not put high hopes on this going on for a long time, especially with US President Trump coming to power and his inauguration and his overtures towards Russia. I mean, the moment Ukraine war is over or there is some kind of a ceasefire, you know, Russia will turn its attention back to the region. And that's not good news for any of the countries in the region.
And what do you make of the latest strategic charter signed between the Armenian government and the US, the back then outgoing Biden administration? Do you think that it will have some considerable bearing? It will have some considerable bearing upon the dynamics within the region?
Absolutely not. You know, one thing I've learned in politics, in examining and studying politics, is that these papers are sometimes not even worth the ink or the paper that they're printed on or agreed upon. And also in the context of especially today's American administration and the changes that we see in politics, it's not inconceivable that the current administration would turn its back completely on this and would forget it. Also, don't forget, I mean, again, this is a president or this is an administration that has little interest in the region. U.S. aid and European aid to Georgia have already been withdrawn. Armenia, is not getting anything, especially with the U.S. aid sanctions. Azerbaijan is sort of protected against these because it never relied on these aids in general. So I think it is just how much they can use it as a political, or how much the Armenian administration can use it as a political tool, as a PR, as a facade.
It's almost impossible to understand Armenia's foreign policy choice without looking at its ties, its bilateral peace process with Azerbaijan, of course. It has been said that for Armenia to be properly independent, with Russian influence being considerably curbed, it needs to have a peace deal with Azerbaijan. It needs to have a proper connectivity agenda put into practice within the South Caucasus. Turkish-Armenian normalization should reach its logical conclusion. Do you, in your analysis, connect the peace process with Azerbaijan, its logical implications and ultimate consequences with the EU aspirations of Armenia? Because it has quite often been said that these three countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, from the European perspective, matter collectively, cumulatively, as a region, and their relations with European institutions should be coordinated in such a fashion that Brussels is not able to institute what Azerbaijani officials and analysts like to call dividing lines in the South Caucasus. What do you make of this, this combination of factors and also analysis?
That's a multifaceted and complex sort of analysis, Orkhan, and the question. First of all, I think one of the things is that any deal, direct deal, bilateral deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan would automatically exclude Russia from the region. And this is not speculation. This is basically looking back at history. The 1994 peace treaty or a ceasefire agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan was a result of bilateral agreement until Russia hijacked it and made it its own. I think by having a bilateral agreement, Russia will be completely sort of thrown out, quote unquote, from the region. Now, in terms of the collectively looking at the region, I think this is a very short-sighted view of people in the West or other places that have no idea about the world outside their doors. I think it is always about it makes their life easier without realizing the multi-nuanced aspects existing in a region. Fine, you can do the Baltic regions together and lump it together because they more or less have similar backgrounds. They have more or less similar political development and more or less similar and overlapping security concerns. You can't do the same thing for the Balkans. And I think they actually use that strategy in the Balkans by not having a collectivistic and one-size-fits-all approach. And I think when it comes to the South Caucasus, it is also the same. It's very similar to the Balkans. It's not the same as the Baltic. But I think, to a large extent, it's about lack of initiative and creative thinking on European and Western policymakers, because if you have to deal with these countries individually, that means more work. That means more nuanced understanding. And that's not, nuanced understanding doesn't seem to be the way that policymakers make policy anymore. But from the perspective, you raised the point about Azerbaijani perspective. Perceptions are perceptions, Orkhan. Yeah. You cannot change it. You can just explain why I am acting in a certain way or why I will be acting in a certain way. And I leave the analysis to you. And I think the mentality of looking at what is good for one side is automatically bad for the other is an approach of a zero-sum game, which doesn't work always. Instead of thinking, I'm using IR term here, prisoner's dilemma, right? Where it is possible that both sides can win. I think this is also a mindset among policymakers in the region that needs to be reevaluated.
It's very interesting you said about both sides winning, actually, because quite often Azerbaijan and Armenian dynamics, Azerbaijan's victory automatically meant Armenia's defeat, and Armenia's victory automatically, at least, meant Azerbaijan's defeat. But Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan very recently, when he was in the United States, said something quite interesting. Azerbaijani analysts have been talking about that particular thing for years. What he said was interesting. He said that, yes, we lost the war of 2020, and in that defeat, we found an opportunity to, I'm just paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly what he said. He said that we found an opportunity to redefine ourselves and to find the reason, find the fundamental underpinnings, eventually leading to our independence. So, Azerbaijani argument expressed by many people was that prior to 2020, Armenia had been under huge Russian influence, and there was a perception that for Armenia to be able to follow its Karabakh policy, relations with Russia should have been kept within certain limits, and Azerbaijan, by means of liberating its Karabakh region, provided Armenia with an opportunity to, first of all, reconsider its relations with Russia, and also to be properly independent nation. And what Pashinyan said in early 2025 was very interesting. It said that this gave us an opportunity to become properly independent. It felt like, my perception of what he said was that he's saying that the defeat in 2020 was a blessing in disguise. What do you make of that argument? Do you think that really, for all the tragedy and suffering that people suffered, of course, for all that mentality shift which should happen, probably happening in Armenia, what happened was inevitable, and this could lead to something which would not have happened under normal circumstances through just the proper bilateral peace negotiations?
Right. No, I mean, Orkhan, there's absolutely a level of self-reflection whenever you face a life-changing event in human as an individual or also as a nation. You do have to take a step back and reflect on it, right? I think this is what Prime Minister Pashinyan mentioned was probably in this context. It is also a mechanism that actually broke to some extent, or at least shattered, or created cracks in the understanding or in the belief among Armenians that Russia is always going to be its ally. And the fact that it didn't do what Armenia expected it to do led to break that. And I think this is a comfortable or initial break from the Russian orbit and, as they would call it, more independence. I think the word independence also is abused a lot. I think there is no such thing as independence. You know, there's so much interdependence in the world today that people have to realize the complex web of these sort of interactions. You know, in Machiavelli's Prince, there is a quote that says that there is little difference between an obstacle and an opportunity. The wise is able to take both, turn both into its advantage. So if you look at things as always something that is stopping you rather than taking it and running with it like a ball, I think probably it could be lip service, but I think there is genuine sort of motivation on Armenia's side to use this defeat and use these shattered and also changing global dynamics into something new, into redesigning something new in the region. Yeah. But it also takes two to tango, right, Orkhan? Yes. I think this is one of the other aspects. I think Azerbaijan has a winning sort of attitude. It's a winner, yet it still does not shed the victim sort of rhetoric that, you know, we suffered and so on and so forth. And I think this is also a break, or can become an obstacle in moving forward. No one is gracious in their victory. That's the problem. Usually, you know, when you're victorious, you have to be gracious and moving on. Neither side have been like that.
Well, let's hope that ultimately there will be peace deal, and that will lead to what in Azerbaijan is very fashionable to call regional self-ownership, which is effectively the construct on the basis that we should be together. We know what is good for us, not those outside powers. And perhaps together, as three countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, we could establish the fundamental principles of our relation with outside world. I think that's what regional self-ownership effectively means. Thank you very much, Aspet. I'm so grateful to you, and hopefully in the fullness of time we'll have similar opportunity and have a more extensive conversation about self-same and many other issues.
Thank you very much, Orkhan.
Thank you, Aspet. This was Dr. Aspet Kochukyan, Professor of Political Science and International Relations. With him, we discussed some of the issues related to Armenia's EU membership bid and related concomitant. See you very soon.